So Ian McLachlan, thank you for talking to Lessons on Leadership.
Well, it's nice to see you, Peter.
Of course, I need to declare an interest here, which is unlike the previous ministers I've interviewed. I worked for you. I was your Chief of Staff for the time that you were Defence Minister, so I can't pretend to be a completely neutral observer, but I'm really looking forward to a discussion of your reflections on what that was like well over 2 decades ago now.
Yes, and I've been rereading some of the stuff that you forced me to say when you wrote it for me. So,
well, we're in a happy position now that, of course, the cabinet records have now released for your time. But let's go back to the beginning and tell me the story of how did you become Defence Minister?
Well, when you are elected and you're sitting around waiting, you hope, for a job, which is at the Prime Minister's call. I think I waited 8 or 10 days, and I never thought about defence at all. I thought I might get another portfolio, which I was interested in. But John rang me up and he said, I think you'd be good at doing this. And I said, well, what about this other portfolio? And he said, no, you've got to do this. So it was amusing because Alexander Downer had been leader of the Liberal Party. So as a previous leader, you can choose your office. And he chose the Defence Office, which was a nice office, you remember. Mm-hmm. You've been there many times and lived in it. And they said, no, you can't have that office. There's the Defence Minister's office and there's stuff in there you can't see, which I've always thought was worth repeating to Alexander anytime I see him. So, look, I'd done national service a few months, as a kid, as an 18-year-old, and I was honoured. I was very pleased and honoured, and we had some very. Tony Ayres was head of the department, and John Baker was chief of the Defence Force, and you came along, and we had some good people in the office, and I was privileged to be there.
Do you recall getting a handover, as it were, from Robert Ray, who was the minister that preceded you from the other side?
I think I had one chat with him. Wasn't very long. I think his view was, it's up to you now, which was interesting because prior to that I'd been the opposition minister for the environment, and John Faulkner had been the Environment Minister, and he asked me to come round to his office and said, I'll give you one talk about everything I know, and after that, you get nothing. Right. And I thought that was an interesting difference.
So you're starting fresh in a portfolio that you hadn't spent much time thinking about, and pretty quickly the paper flow from Defence begins. And Defence is notorious for the amount of paper it pushes towards ministers.
Acronyms.
What was your sort of reaction to the workload? How did you think about what you needed to do as a minister, sort of starting out in this area?
Well, I asked the office to simplify some of the acronyms. I mean, I had 9 of them in the first 3 paragraphs of some early document I got, and I thought that they all needed at least the description of what they were before you started. I mean, that's how bad, in my case, how far behind the 8 ball I was.
Yes.
But look, Bert, I found everybody extremely helpful, so there was no problem about that. You pick it up. Understanding where everything is in the country was one of the more difficult things. And but over time, I mean, you get around. We got around, and you meet a lot of people, and the quality of the people was, I thought, very high, and I got on with them. I mean, it was easy. There was no difficulties that I came across, either in the department or in the Defence Force itself.
What sort of relationship did you build with the Secretary Tony Ayres and General John Baker, the Chief of Defence Force?
Tony was interesting. He would come into the office. They came in together as it was a diarchy. I almost had to look that up, really, and Tony would come in and he'd rub his nose a bit and he'd have some bit of confidential information which he would deliver. And look, together they were an ideal combination. I mean, they'd obviously talked about everything that they brought to the office. They agreed with it and about it, and they had also their own positions on things from the departmental point of view or from the military point of view. But it was easy. The relationship was easy.
One of the things that you did quite early on in the process was begin what turned out to be quite an ambitious reform exercise in the department, which was the Defence Efficiency Review, which then in implementation turned into the Defence Reform Program. What were your thoughts behind starting that exercise?
Well, reading a couple of things recently, because I was coming up here, I was reminded that you wanted to write a white paper. I'd forgotten about that, but I didn't want white papers. I was really more interested in doing something.
Yes.
And I realised that the economic circumstance, the financial circumstances of the department were limited. So we thought, I thought, with advice, why wouldn't we look at all the things that we didn't need, or could we readjust what we were doing and save some money so we could spend the money on on assets, military assets? And I mean, to quote the extreme example, we had some golf courses. Well, we didn't really need golf courses because they were being built all over Australia in any case, too many, as it turns out, to some extent. So that took about 3 years all up, that Defence Efficiency Review, as it was called. I think they did a good job. Malcolm McIntosh chaired that, a bright man. We had some good people. You would know more about the end result of that, but I think it was well over $1 billion, which, whether it did or didn't, was supposed to finally finish up, giving us more ability to build or purchase things.
Yes. Well, here's where I guess part of my self-interest comes into this, because I see this as being something that was necessary, even though you'll recall at the time it wasn't that popular amongst the defence organisation. But my view was that it really got defence in a better place for the crisis that came shortly after your time, which was the East Timor deployment, for which defence was not prepared at the time the Howard government came to office. So it was necessary medicine, in my view. And I guess that's something to talk about, Ian. Was you sort of brought a businessman's perspective to the
Well, there were other
job?
things that happened before that. I mean, do you remember the previous government had bought these two helicopter landing ships, sort of second or third hand, or whatever they were.
Yes.
The Kanimbla was the one that I think was number one, and it was called a Kanimbla class. And one of the first questions that came into my office was, we're going to do it up? Was it worth the purchase? I can't remember whether we still had to complete the purchase or whatever. Or do we build some new ones that are big enough to take what you might call an army group, or whatever you call them these days, with all of the accoutrements that go with, including helicopters. And we decided to do them up so that later, if that worked, you could go on and do what is now known as the Canberra class, which looked to be fantastic. I think that was one good decision we made. The second decision, which was already somewhat not planned, but in the conversation with the previous government, was that General Sanderson, as Chief of Army, was asked to look at the redisposition, if you like, of the army, and think about putting the army into groups. In other words, you don't have the shooters over here and the artillery down there and the sapper somewhere else. And I mean, you get them all into one. So the first one was to be Darwin. I always remember that, because when he was explaining that to me, I couldn't understand these changes, or where they were going, because there were lots of them. And you might remember we asked him to draw a map of the old and the new.
Yep.
And it took 10 days for the map to turn up. So then we all understood it. And it actually, that seems to me part of the Darwin, East Timor, getting this stuff together. And Chris Barry said to me, well, few years after all that, he retired and I retired, obviously, a long time, that they were able to start something from there with already reconditioned helicopter landing ships, which went on to become something else later on.
And from that, of course, we have the largest deployment since Vietnam into Timor, everything that happened in Iraq and Afghanistan since. Talking about equipment, submarines.
Just before you get to that,
yes,
the other part of that was we'd already had this discussion about border defence, as it was called. That is, the defence of Australia and its waters, if you like, which was the previous government's public policy, even though, to some extent, Bob Hawke had sent people to the Gulf in '91, so not a great lot of people, but certainly it was an effort. And so the business of changing from a border force was quite a difficult debate, to one that would be a little more mobile, able to move more, able to put a group together and go and do something to keep the region more secure, was where we really got to.
Yes.
Which was, and the big question was, well, Minister, why? Who's going to attack us? Who's the enemy? Well, the answer is you don't know. You don't know. Well, you didn't know then, maybe. I mean, was it Indonesia? No, it wasn't Indonesia. But so what was it? Well, be prepared.
We have a better sense, I guess, of the threat today.
Sadly.
But let's go back to equipment for a bit. I also want to talk about some of those deployments that we made, but sort of top of my mind is the Collins submarine story. The cabinet documents now show that as the Howard government came in, the HMAS Collins was getting very close to launch. Farncombe number 2 wasn't far behind it. But there were just the faintest signals beginning that maybe we have some problems with these boats. Can you talk about your sort of early memories of how the Collins story kind of revealed itself to you as Minister?
Well, Collins wasn't even commissioned, but it was in trials. And there was a day-to-day, I used to come to the Parliament House wondering what news would come in from Collins tomorrow. And there were plenty. I mean, first of all, there was noise problem. There was a cavitation problem. Nobody knew whether it was the propellers, the design of the propellers, or the cavitation, whatever it was. There were problems with the engines. You might remember 6 engines were designed, new design, which seemed to be a sort of madness. Then there were other things like the acoustic tiles falling off and so forth. But the biggest problem was the integration of the combat system, which obviously did not work. Now, I remember the skipper of Collins saying, when I was down with him out at sea off Thistle Island, off the continental shelf, so he explained to me why it doesn't work. And he said, well, you see all those computers there? They're all supposed to be integrated, and I'm supposed to get a message which tells me what I can or can't do. And that's not working. That was a simple way of explaining this, and I'm not sure that it ever got solved by Rockwell's before I left. But they were solving these problems. And Electric Boat solved some of them, the American company and so forth. And my biggest two problems, you had them as well in a way, but my problem, one of them was political. Everybody said, oh, it's a disaster. I mean, why is something wrong with it? Even my Liberal associates that I knew well, why can't these submarines work? I mean, the reason was, if you try to build something at leading edge, it is by definition you're going to have these problems. And you have to solve them bit by bit. And you had to go outside. We had to go outside to our friends in many cases to solve them. And that was the first thing. The second thing was that I couldn't get anywhere with Cockham's. I mean, Cockham's would say, we will fix it, and it wouldn't get fixed, or we will solve this in cricketing terms, they were unplayable, I found. I just unplayable. I know they've changed ownership and so forth now, but I found them extremely difficult.
And there was a point where this stopped being just sort of a technical issue between defence and the industry, and all of a sudden it became a really big public issue.
Sure.
And you'll remember the dud subs. There was a line about sounds like a rock band underwater, and all of a sudden this was like a full-on page one disaster that we were dealing with. What are your thoughts as Minister about how you deal with those sorts of full-on media crises?
Well, was it Shakespeare said, the evil that men do lives after them, the good is oft interred within their bones? Well, the thing about submarines is you know all about the things that go wrong with submarines, and you're not allowed to tell anybody about the good things that submarines do. And that's a perennial submarine issue. If the submarines aren't appearing in the press, they're going okay. But if you're trying to build something at the front edge of technology, and I mean, give Kim Beazley credit for trying to do this, I have no criticism of that at all. Although subsequent Liberal coalition ministers did criticise him, but I didn't. I thought that was puerile myself. We had a job to do, and that was to try and get them on the water, under the water, and respected. But it was the dud sub was a difficulty, but it was a lack of understanding. And I've thought since I should have been more forceful in saying, if you don't understand that this happens to every single front end new invention, F-111s, F-35s right now, all this stuff, it's a long drawn out process, and even more so now because the technology is changing minute by minute.
And there's a general, almost Australian character trait which believes that our equipment is going to be a failure. I mean, I find that quite surprising how so many average Australians will react to a story about submarines and conclude, well, they just must be disasters. Whereas
the air warfare destroyer is an interesting thing, which is long after I came along. But the first one was way over cost. Second one was, as I understand it, quite close to cost. And the third one's under. I mean, you've got to build the stuff to get the expertise. Otherwise, you have to buy them off somebody else's shelf, and you're not always going to get top of the pops.
A couple of other equipment issues which percolated through in your time. Anzac Ships, different story, pretty successful from the get-go. And as the Howard government came in, they were still on budget, on time, and being delivered successfully all the way through.
But designed and brought in by the previous government.
Yes.
Welded ships too, which was interesting. I always remember that we had a problem. Do you remember? I think we sent Anzac down to chase some Patagonian toothfish people away. And the seas in the Southern Ocean are so big that the welding started to give them a little bit of a problem, whereas the older air warfare, the older destroyers, or the frigates, I can't remember, they moved a bit because they were bolted or put together in a different way. So it was quite interesting how we made this rigid. The rigidity was a slight disadvantage in the really rough sea.
Interesting. The other one that's worth touching on briefly, of course, was Sprites helicopter, which was a Howard McLachlan brackets Jennings story that turned out not to be so successful in subsequent years. Any sort of recollections of the Sprites story?
I can recollect not knowing what to do about these things. Do we do these up? Do we go and buy some new ones? Whatever it was. And one way or another it didn't work, as it turned out.
Now, you said you had good relations with Tony Ayres and John Baker, but when you get into that situation and you're uncertain about how to proceed, how did you find dealing with defence at those moments?
I never had a single problem with John. I could talk to John about anything at all. I mean, it was quite interestingly when you first meet these people, they're looking at you across the desk and they think this guy knows nothing, and you know he'd been exiting the last of our troops out of Vietnam and so on. And Tony Ayres had been there for a long time, was very experienced bureaucrat, but very sadly the Black Hawk helicopter crash took place about 7 weeks, 6-7 weeks after I became minister. And John and I we'd been flown from Sydney to Tasmania, and Tasmania we were on our way to Woomera, and we got patched in with this news. And all of a sudden we just got going. He came to Canberra for a day or two to do something. I came to Canberra and straight on that night to Townsville, and suddenly the relationship changed because we had a very, very sad job to do, and we had to do it. And from that moment onwards, I never had I found him very high quality. And I also found, I didn't find a problem with the bureaucrats at all. There may have been difficulties down further. There were the sorts of problems I think Defence had were the same sorts of problems that the population was having. We're never going to talk about nuclear-powered anything, for example, because we're not going to talk about it. Why aren't we going to talk about it? Well, because we're not have that debate. Sort of a madness of closed minds, but it wasn't just. I didn't think it was just a defence thing. It was an Australian thing because somebody had blown up a couple of bombs in Japan.
Yeah. On international issues, one of the first crises that the government had to deal with was, well, it was two crises really. It was the situation on Bougainville Island, where we had secessionists versus the Papua New Guinea Defence Force, and it fell to you to work out how we could put a peace monitoring group into the island to broker a pretty fragile peace that had been negotiated. And then we had the Sandlines crisis, which was the PNG government's attempt to bring in some British mercenaries to fix the Bougainville situation once and for all. Tell us a little bit about your experience of those two things.
Well, we had this peace monitoring group, which really, I mean, you could go and talk to the Papua New Guineans, but they had a couple of goes at trying to pacify the Bougainvillians who, as you know, had shut Rio Tinto copper mine and were of a mind of their own, shall we say, and the PNG government failed. So they obviously decided, forget about the peace monitoring group, we will go and find ourselves some mercenaries. And as it turned out, I think they found Jardine Fleming in London, which is a international finance house with great history in Hong Kong, and a couple of people who have been in the public space, or were in the public space not long after that, a fellow called McGowan and one or two others. And they found Sandline, which was a mercenary company, and another one which expedited gear called Executive Outcomes. And they hired them. They hired them to fly out some very serious helicopter gunships and other stuff, machine guns, and God knows what, rocketry. And they were going to, and about 40 people, 36 to 40 mercenaries, were South Africans, Brits, a couple of Australians, and various people like Czechs, I think. This 124 Antonov is a gigantic aeroplane, and they're all in that. Some of the mercenaries are already in PNG. And I can't remember whether you brought the message in or John Baker did, but they knew that this Antonov was on Langkawi Island. And the Malaysians told us, we'll let you know when it's about to go, because we were talking to the Malaysians about all this stuff. And so the arrangement was that when the 124 was 2 hours out of Langkawi. It would be told it couldn't go back. Malaysians would tell them couldn't go back to Malaysian airspace, and we would tell them, you're not landing in Moresby, you're landing at Darwin, and if you don't, there'll be a couple of F-18s or something, we'll make sure you land, which they did. They landed there. And now you can fly down to Tyndall, where they were refueled in one place or another, unloaded. All this stuff was unloaded and put into the F-18 hangar or two. And these guys were told to take their 1-2 and off and go back to Europe, Eastern Europe. And then, of course, Mr. Spicer from Sandline went to PNG and was locked up for about 5 weeks, I think because the PNG government wanted to get their $18 million that they'd paid in advance back. And of course the whole thing blew up, and the Prime Minister of PNG lost his job over it, Chan. High Vita lost his job over it. The Minister of Ijapi, Mr. Ijapi, whom I'd met a few times, and he lost his job over it. And they were going to beat up their bougainvilleans with their own military people, and their chief of army,
yes,
Jerry Sinyarock, did not know. Now that was amazing circumstance, and we said, no mercenaries in our area.
Yes,
don't want them.
Yes.
We'll get them out. And we did.
This was really the first test of the Howard government from a crisis management point of view, and the National Security Committee of Cabinet kind of turned itself into a crisis management organisation. What's your memory of dealing with John Howard and the other NSC members at the time?
On that issue, there wasn't a single problem.
Right.
I mean, everybody understood that we're not going to have mercenaries floating around up here in PNG. I mean, it was a difficulty trying to keep the PNG government from going over there and having another whack at them. And look, I don't know, it didn't help the stability of the PNG government, but on the other hand, it was in our bailiwick, and so we said we're not going to have it. And look, there was no problem about getting agreement. I mean, John understood that straight away. As I understand it, when East Timor took place, John got much more understanding of what was required in an Australian military force all round. But of course, when he first becomes Prime Minister, you know, there's a lot of things to do. The first one of which is to stay Prime Minister.
Another international issue, perhaps maybe 6 to 9 months after Sandlines, was the decision to deploy Australian forces to Kuwait. And this was to support the American no-fly zone over southern Iraq, which was in place at that moment. And what we ultimately decided to do was to deploy the special forces whose task would have been to go in and rescue a downed aircraft pilot if one of the coalition aircraft had been shot down. What are your memories of the cabinet discussions about that and the different options that might have been on the government's table?
Well, we had notice from, at least John Howard had notice from President Clinton that there might be or his people, that there might be a formal question coming through from, I think we had 3 weeks notice, something like that, a formal question coming through from the Americans, will you send somebody over? Because we think Saddam Hussein is getting ambitious again, shall we put it that way. And I think, if I remember rightly, the Americans finished up with about 50,000 troops back in Kuwait again, ready to deal with that. The cabinet discussion, I think was sort of a bit on the soft side for a start. We're going to send the Red Cross or something, somebody suggested. But we needed to send somebody who looked serious. Okay, so the SAS was important. We sent a couple of refuelers. As you said, the SAS had particular jobs to do, which didn't look as though they were going to war particularly. But I mean, if he had attacked, they certainly would have been in a different position instantly. Funnily enough, even though the New Zealanders were sort of out of the military conversation altogether, there were New Zealanders in our SAS. And when I met a couple of them there, I said, you're not Australian, you're a New Zealander. And they said, yeah, but none of these Yanks can tell the difference between our accents. so we had New Zealanders in our SAS. But then we had, as I said, refuelers and so forth. So, and I think some of it, I'm not sure. I can't remember whether F-18s were doing a bit of that work.
No, I remember there was discussion about the possibility of sending F-18s and F-111s, but they didn't have the electronic warfare defence systems, and so it was felt that it wasn't safe to do that. And
I think they subsequently did, though.
In later
and they
deployment.
did it later, that's correct.
But there was a bit of surprise around the cabinet table. I recall, Ian, over sort of learning from defence. So you mean you're not able to deploy these aircraft? And that was when the Special Forces came forward as an issue.
But we had to send somebody that looked as though we were serious.
Yes.
I mean, it wasn't a big force, and Saddam Hussein hadn't done anything, but it was just, he was worrying that the Kuwaitis and the Americans again. But there was a discussion about whether we'd just send a token, something or other, which was disappointing, but nevertheless we did send some SAS guys over there, and they, I don't think that was big, but it was accepted by the Americans in any case.
Was it a tough decision?
No.
For you? You didn't
No.
pause on...
No, I mean, look, I've always held the view that Australia needs to be in lockstep as a smaller, we are smaller, with the Americans. Now I know that people criticise the Americans or Mr. Trump or Mr. this or Mr. that, but the fact of the matter is that if we want peace in a Western sense, the Americans and ourselves need to trust each other completely.
So Ian, one of the things you did as Minister was spend quite a lot of time in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. What was the thinking behind those engagements?
Well, I thought people must have spent a lot of time on it with Indonesia and so forth. As it turns out, maybe we hadn't spent enough time. Anyway, the first Defence Minister I had anything to do was a fellow called Eddie Sudrajat. I met him in Indonesia. He came down to Adelaide. I took him to the golf course. I took him to our house. I thought the thing to do was to get to know them personally so you could get to the point of making a telephone call. So so I went there maybe six times. I don't, a lot, and I think to some extent I never got anywhere close to the leaders, but on the defence minister. I mean, I had long talks with Mr. General Wiranto, but he turned out to be a very difficult fellow with an agenda of his own. Yeah. Towards the end of my term, but. We had some difficulties in Malaysia, but you remember when the sandline business, they gave us the information straight away, very cooperative, no problem. Singapore was, of course, always very, very helpful and very cooperative. But we went to Thailand, we went all over the place up there, and I think that the best way to get close to what's happening is to get to the point where you can make the phone call and they take the phone call, and not 4 days later. And that's what I tried to do. I wasn't in the early days. Wasn't actively trying to do that, but I found that, for instance, I had the Japanese defence minister dinner in my house. He'd never been in. That never happened, according to Michael Hughes, who worked in the office. He said that would never happen, but it made a lot of difference, I think.
And those defence connections, as opposed to diplomatic links, have really been very strong between Australia and a number of Southeast Asian countries.
Well, we train a lot of those kids. I mean, let's face it, we train them, and there's two reasons for training them. One is to teach them how to do things properly. The other thing is to teach them how to do them in a way that we would all believe in.
Respecting human rights and those sorts of things. So.
Yeah. I mean, look, it's relationships are just about as personal relationships at the top. I mean, are extremely important. Now, I know everybody's going to run into roadblocks along the way, but if you can get the phone call, you may be able to work your way over a period, work your way around a roadblock that otherwise you couldn't do because nobody will change their mind or there is no other solution.
What was your relationship like with John Howard? Because he did develop a reputation of really being his own defence minister, maybe more around Timor times and after, but how did you get on with the Prime Minister and his interest in the defence portfolio?
He didn't interfere with us at all, really. I mean, once we had the Defence Efficiency Review, well, then we'd pacified Treasury because Costello wasn't going to rip any more money off defence because we were going to save it anyway. I think it took John a little while to realise that he needed to be more active in the business. He let me do. We did. I don't think I had any disagreement at all with him in the 2 3/4 years that I was there, except in about the last 6 months. He said, "No decisions will be made by the departments without coming through me." Well, that was the pre-election stuff. But we'd made all the decisions that we had to make, and they were just being implemented or not implemented depending on how well people were going. So that didn't interfere with us at all. I understand later though that after, and I think he said it himself, that after East Timor, he was much more focused on this business of being able to do things, not talk about it, but actually able to go and perform in a limited sense.
I remember, Ian, probably about 8 or so weeks out from the 98 campaign, you weren't in Canberra, but I took a call from Tony Nutt, who then put John Howard on to me to express his displeasure at one of the outcomes of the Defence Efficiency Review, which was the sale of Fort Queenscliff in Victoria, which was in the electorate of Corangamite, which was a pretty marginal electorate. And in a very polite but direct way, Stuart MacArthur's seat.
My friend Stuart MacArthur.
Your friend. And Howard sort of let me know that he was not the least bit impressed with this, and I sort of had to say, well, I'm sorry, Prime Minister, but that decision was taken a long time ago and now the sale is finalised, and which he took very well, but that was about the only occasion I recall Howard being sort of unhappy with the portfolio at that time.
Yes, well, that defence facility down there was set up because the Russians were causing a bit of problem in 1880 or sometime like that, and the weaponry there was probably not exactly up to spec.
Ian, of the defence ministers that I've spoken to for this series already, a number have reflected on just how high the workload was. A number have said it's the toughest job they've done. Did you find that? How did you react to the workload of the Defence Department?
The workload didn't worry me, except that you needed to be in a safe seat because they all felt you were leaving them behind. I mean, because you had no time to go wandering around at the weekends being nice to people, and all of the gaps in the parliamentary program you were in. Up in Southeast Asia or somewhere, and somewhere else anyway, and people noticed that. But on the other hand, I think if people thought you're doing a good job, and they felt, that you're doing a good job, that they forgave you most of that. Although if you weren't taking the phone calls there either, it can be a bit of a problem.
Yes.
I didn't leave for any reason like that. I left because I had a health problem as I've still slightly got, which was major. I couldn't sleep, and so I couldn't sleep. I couldn't, and then after a while you get to the point where you got to make a decision. And as I said before, I've been to Canberra for one reason or another, for the Farmers Federation, for the Wool Council, for this, for that, for 20 years, and the cabinet and the senior membership of the Liberal Party looked good. Looked as though the coalition was in a good place. The National Party had a good fellow as leader. It looked fine to me. They didn't need me.
Ian, as you look back on the job, what for you are the high points of having been Minister for Defence?
Oh, the people we had. I mean, I was lucky, Peter. You knew all those people well. We had a very good office, and they weren't subservient to the minister either, which was very good. I would have liked to have stayed on, except that I wasn't well, and I mean I couldn't. I don't bore you with that, but also I got jumped slightly because John just announced we were going to have an election, and I thought we would go through to March the next year, which didn't happen, and I would have been able to give him some notice about that, and we could have looked at other political things. The other thing I have to say that I was helped by Tim Fisher. I mean, Tim Fisher was, if I had any doubts about the wisdom of this or that, I would go and ask Tim what he thought, because he was always, he'd been to Vietnam, he knew all these people. We also knew some of the Americans pretty well. John Baker had very good associates in America that he could get on the phone. This is the other thing about this. You need to know these people well enough to be able to ring them up and talk to them. Yeah. So the Vice President of the United States under George W. was one of those that we could ring. It was interesting. One of the interesting things to me about this was that when Clinton was president, his second defence minister was a Republican. In other words, they were big enough, if you think, in their mind, to say who's the best guy. And I don't know whether he was or whether he wasn't, but Bill Cohen became the Defence Secretary, and I don't think that's going to happen today, and that's sad, because that's more of a common effort. One thing I do think, looking back on all this, is in regard to assets, material, defence material, what you're going to buy, because some of this stuff takes you 10, 12 years, 15 years. You need a committee of the Parliament, and almost by definition, some of those people are going to be very senior, and probably a number of senators, because they get a longer term, who are in the know about everything. They do have this in America, I mean, more or less. And that gives, to me, from the point of view of the build and what you're going to, you need that sort of continuity. For example, very reluctantly, I got the Cabinet to agree, or the Security Committee of the Cabinet, to agree that we would start the design of the next tranche of submarines. Well, that's about the most unpopular thing I could have said to anybody at that stage, because everybody's complaining about the submarines. Yeah. But I thought that the designing of that would take 10 years. I also, since then, retrospectively maybe, thought, well, at least the nuclear discussion would be in the game. But sadly, it is not in the game. No. And the first thing you would have done was to go to the Americans and say, look, we got these Collins-class submarines. They work well with your guys. They're starting to come along. What do you think? I mean, where are we going? Where are we going from there? Now, that didn't happen. And I remember a subsequent defence minister saying to me, 12 years later, he pulled out the submarine drawer and it was empty. It was a good way of describing gone, because that whole idea was canned by one of our defence ministers afterwards. And the other thing that I felt was sad was that we never really seriously approached the Americans about the F-22. Now, I know everybody say we don't need the F-22. We didn't need the F-22, but had we had a squadron of F-22s and, as well, the F-35. Now, I know all that's changed, and maybe submarines are going to be different, but I cannot understand, I just cannot get my mind around why we produce all this yellow cake, we sell it to the world, and yet we're frightened to use it. So hypocrisy defeats me.
Can't have the conversation.
No.
Did you have any regrets as you left the Parliament, Ian? I mean, I know there was some health issues there, but...
I only about defence.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew from my party point of view, I knew the setup. Nobody else did, but Howard and Costello and I knew it was all arranged. Didn't come to pass like that, and it blew up in the end. But it was arranged, and I was asked to do the meeting and get it organised. So we had Howard there. They were working well. There was a decent senior people in the cabinet. You had Reith and Fisher and Costello and Hill and Downer. I mean, they were all getting to be pretty experienced people. They didn't need me. I'd been going to Canberra for 60 years. So for 20 years, I was 62. It was time to let somebody else have a go. My slight disappointment was that the defence job was considered as being, there, but parcelled around. Now, if I'd stayed for another 3 years, well, we might have solidified the thing a bit. And I slightly regret that, but on the other hand, I won't bore you with what was right, but I need to change.
Looking at the portfolio now, lots of ministers have come and gone pretty quickly since. What advice would you offer to a new minister if one of them rang you up and said, what should I do with this job?
I would advise him to go and put together, to persuade his Prime Minister that you have to put together a group of decision-making joint party politicians with the ability to pull in on a totally 1,000% confidential, whatever you like, basis, advice. Unlike you, I don't like white papers because they take people's eye off what's going to happen, it seems to me. But if you had this continuum of thought process where these people, and there's enough people in there now, they know a bit, where you could, that whatever's decided in this government will be continued on because it was decided jointly. Now, I used to tell my opposition minister almost everything. It was, when we went to the Gulf or when we did, I can't remember whether we did Sandline, but we'd have a chat. He didn't talk to anybody. He'd tell Kim Beazley. That's about it. But I just think that's what I would do to change things, because you need, this whole nonsense that's going on with the submarines at the moment. It's just, one government says this and that doesn't happen. Another government does something else. Madness. It's madness. These are such long-term processes that you need long-term view in the decision-making.
Yes.
And then defence would have its view, but it can't be the only view, because in the end the politicians exercise those decisions.
David Fawcett has a similar idea. David Fawcett, Senator from your own state, has a similar idea that there needs to be a sort of a stronger bipartisan sort of collaboration.
Absolutely.
But are we ever going to see that, given our political system?
Well, look, if it was ever needed, it's now. Everybody does it in wartime. The Brits did it in the Second World War, the First World War. So did Australia. There was a, whatever you call it, there was a group who were in the know about everything. And I think that's what you need. And they ought to be sworn through the system, and that's that, and they can't talk about it ever then or ever after. I'm quite surprised to see ex-military leaders talking about all their times and what they did and so forth, especially about, in some cases, where submarines and stuff we're still using. But that's what I'd do. That's the first thing I would do, and I'd get the Prime Minister to get him in and go and talk to the Leader of the Opposition and say, look, this is too important now. See, once upon a time, the distances were greater. Distances are shorter today by dint of technology. Distances could be as fast as the speed of light.
Yeah. Ian, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you. It's been great to talk to you.
Nice to see you, Peter.